Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This reading was produced using Natural Reader 14, a product of Natural Soft Limited. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Part 1. The Seditious Genius of the Spiritual Penis of Jesus. How Christianity's subversion of kin-selective altruism evolved into the modern idea of social progress. Good news. The Trojan horse is here. And we bring you the good news that what God promised to our ancestors He has fulfilled for us, their children, by raising Jesus. Acts, chapter 13, verses 32 through 33. Christian altruism, the selfish meme. What is hate? Why are so many people prejudiced against hate? It is often believed that hate is hateful and should be hated. It is often some of the very same people who also believe that intolerance is intolerable and should not be tolerated. Well then, instead of making a virtue of hypocrisy, let us something different, let us actually try to understand hate. My subject here is not all varieties of hate, but rather, the kind of hate associated with racism or xenophobia. The roots of this form of hate can be discerned in its original evolutionary function as a genetic adaptation. Racism, xenophobia, and other hate feelings may be the product of an immunological response of a kin-selective social body. From this socio-biological perspective, the love mechanism of Christianity functions as an inhibitor of the socio-biological body immune response of hate towards strangers. If xenophobic hate is like a socio-biological immune response to foreign bodies such as strangers, Christian memes dismantle the capacity for resistance to foreign social bodies by dismantling the capacity for hate. Christianity meme viruses are comparable to the HIV virus that causes AIDS in that the religion, like HIV, specifically attacks the immune system. In attacking the immune system of a kin-selective body, Christian meme viruses spread as a religion with effects that are comparable to AIDS. What kills the AIDS victim in the end is usually not the HIV virus itself, but rather, opportunistic diseases that exploit the reduced capacity for immunological resistance by the victim. To follow Jesus's dictate to hate the family means that the Christian must hate kin selection in principle or spirit. Kin selection posits a genetic basis for altruism, and this means that immunosociobiological reactions such as xenophobia may often be the unconscious expression of genes. Just as one is generally unaware of the working of the genes responsible for the beating of one's heart, the pagan Roman who inclined towards family favoritism through hatred of outsiders was in most cases acting more unconsciously than conscientiously. The etymological relationship between conscience and consciousness is significant here. For Christianity, conscience works through an emphasis on awareness of one's moral behavior, while pagan naturalism generally not aspire to such extreme inhibitions of natural inclinations toward kin-selective behavior. However, when one does attempt to think about one's behavior and bring unconscious inclinations towards the light of consciousness, the radical standard of Christian self-immolation in altruism presents a unique perplexity. On one hand, altruism, in itself, would seem to be the very negation of any self-interest. On the other hand, common kin-selective selfish altruism towards mother, father, sister, and brother appear not only self-contradictory in relation to the Christian standard, but also highly provincial and limited in their aspirations. If the greatest virtue of a Roman is embodied in duty to Rome, and the greatest realization of duty is self-sacrifice, then on the level of abstract thought, self-sacrifice is the highest virtue. Yet Roman duty is inherently unable to compete with Jesus's idealization of altruism in itself. Jesus's radicalization of altruism lays bare the selfish motivations of empire, and refutes its claims to own the common good. If Jesus himself was half Roman, his emphasis on a standard of decisive superiority to Roman duty may have been reconciliation with himself as a half-Jew. The internal struggle between the two opposite extremes of his Jewish self and his Roman self may have wrought an identity with selflessness in itself. Think of Christian selflessness and altruism as memes attempting to propagate themselves. As a supreme ideal of selflessness on the level of abstract thought, on the level of the meme, the Christian standard of altruism is inherently superior to any notion of duty to the worldly powers of the family or the state. The entire creed complex of Christianity capitalizes on the fact that as an ideal of altruism it is superior, and this, in turn, reinforces this meme complex's ability to point to its own superiority and justify, perpetuate, and expand its own selfishness as a purely cultural meme phenomenon. The superior standard of Christian altruism legitimates its mimetic selfishness in the form of legitimating its own self-replication or imperial perpetuation. Taking the self of altruism, The self-seeking selfishness of altruism in itself to its logical extreme necessarily sabotages its original biological evolutionary raison d'être. Total altruistic negation of the logic of the selfish gene leads to total bodily selflessness, total powerlessness, and an ethic of genetic self-destruction. The most universalistic altruism would be the genetic suicide of all humanity. Christian altruism can be looked upon as the survival strategy of Christian memes that are waging an evolutionary war against the genes of the believing Christian. Now, one might say, this altruism of Christian memes isn't really altruistic. That's right. Altruism as it evolved in meme culture really is not altruistic in the strict sense of true selflessness, and this is what sociobiology exposed. Like the selfish selflessness of kin selection, the selfish selflessness of Christian memes thrives in apparent paradox. Christianity possesses an inherent mimetic genius at spreading itself across the earth because it is strategically designed to simultaneously exploit and subvert kin-selective altruism. It exploits altruism by seducing many of those with the most highly developed valuation of altruism evolved through genetic adaptation. It subverts this kin-selective altruism by uprooting its behavioral expressions against its original basis in genetic adaptation. The notion of God the Father, for example, leeches parasitically upon a classical model of patriarchy while deracinating its genetically adaptive origins. The conflict here is natural kin selection versus Christian stranger selection, a more pagan discriminate love versus Christian indiscriminate love. The secret of the universalism of Christianity, then, is this countering of kin selection that promotes the reversal of the social mechanisms of inclusive genetic fitness. More specifically, Christianity works by reversing the normative kin-selective prioritization between kinship and altruism. If kin-selective behaviors are those that effectively subordinate altruism to kinship, then Jesus's anti-kin-selective behaviors are those that subordinate kinship to altruism. If normative kin selection depends on altruism as a means of genes, then the ethics of Jesus reverse this relationship, demanding that genes become the means and servants of altruistic ends. There is an unmistakable conflict of interests between genes and memes here, and in this conflict, Jesus is unmistakable on the side of the God memes. According to Mark chapter 3, verses 31 through 35, Jesus asked, "Who are my mothers and brothers?" And looking at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mothers and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." To follow Jesus is to obey God over one's genes, to obey these Jesus memes over one's mother and father. The patriarchal family is correlated with kin selection since it represents a hierarchical division of labor that evolved through its conduciveness to gene propagation, i.e. the woman is subordinate to her role as gene propagator. Christianity taught Gentiles a lesson integral to the original innovation of Judaism: jump out of the socio-biological system so as to approach a God's eye view of things. If the socio-biological system begins with the family and culminates in Caesar, Jesus took the jump out of the system one step further from Judaism by attacking and overriding the roots of the system found in the bonds of the family. For Jesus, the half-Jew/half-Roman, this made sense as one rejected by both the Jewish familial system and the Roman familial system. Jesus effectually hacked the socio-biological system by propagating memes that, like a Trojan horse, infiltrate and change the rules of the system from the inside out. This is one way of looking at how Christianity gradually spread like an epidemic and overtook the Roman Empire. The two kinds of predators, carnivores and parasites, correspond to the differential predatory survival strategies of Rome and Christianity. Between them is a struggle between genes and memes, power and influence, body and spirit. While carnivores rely on their superior strength and size, parasites must balance predation on their host with the minimal level of health requisite for the host's existence. Viruses, for example, are classic parasites. They can reproduce themselves only by penetrating a host cell and injecting their genetic material so that the host constructs new viruses from the injected genetic code. New copies of the original virus then extrude or bud from the host. The units of cultural information called memes have been called viruses because they also display this pattern of parasitism upon their primary hosts, human minds. All of the theologies, texts, and cultural inheritances that constitute Christian memes depend on the minds of their human hosts for their reproduction. Early Christianity displayed the same viral pattern from penetration to dissemination as it spread bottom up through the Roman Empire. Like a virus, early Christianity penetrated the minds of its hosts and injected its laws or codes of behavior. Christian moral codes call for behavior very different from the pagan naturalism that was usually more compatible with the unadorned genetic code of its host. Also, like a virus, the Christian law of love contained evangelical instructions for its replication and further dissemination. Christian ethics, so depraved from the standpoint of genetic fitness, live parasitically off genetic inclinations towards altruism evolved primarily through kin selection. Kin selection is by nature and definition exclusive, and Jesus generally stood for including the excluded. A part outsider with Judaism, Jesus was also part outsider as a Roman. In expanding the scope of Judaism for the excluded, he expanded appeal of Judaic tradition for the Gentiles. By opening a place for the foreign within the context of Judaism, Jesus opened a place for the Judaic within the context of the Roman world. Jesus's emphasis on treating outsiders as insiders among Jews ultimately brought Gentile outsiders of Judaism into the biblical world. In this way, the Christian meme virus exploded the socio-biological walls of the late Roman Empire. The Gospels portray Jesus as deliberately commanding his followers to spread his message, and his ultimate intentions may be gleaned from the parable of mustard seed. This is the only parable attributed to Jesus that has three independent attestations. The following version is from Mark chapter 4, verses 30 through 32, "With what can we compare the kingdom of God, or what parable shall we use for it? It is like a grain of mustard seed, which, when sown upon the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds on earth, yet when it is sown it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs, and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade." Roman author Pliny the Elder, 23–79 CE, noted in his encyclopedic Natural History that mustard grows entirely wild, though it is improved by being transplanted, but on the other hand when it has once been sown it is scarcely possible to get the place free of it, as the seed when it falls germinates at once. So while mustard with its pungent taste and fiery effect is extremely beneficial for the health, even the domesticated variety breeds rapidly and can overrun the garden. If this strain is dangerous, then the wild one can wreak an agricultural epidemic. It not only gets out of control like a weed, but also can attract the further danger of nesting birds to the point of destroying the garden. The way of this aggressively multiplying weed, in Jesus's parable, was the way of the kingdom of God, a dangerous, pungent shrub with fiery effect that takes over where it is not wanted. Love was not only beneficial, but also necessary, to the health of the Roman patriarchal imperial order. However, too much of a good thing can become absolutely deadly if not controlled within prescribed bounds. Roman altruism and the Roman sense of duty was part of what made their empire one of the most effective political forces the world has ever known. But an altruism that is not disciplined, altruism that does not know its place, and altruism that does not conform to the order of the carefully cultivated Roman garden has the power to engender its very opposite. The mustard seeds of Christian memes helped bring down the greatest power of its time. Paul, the most eminent Jesus freak of his generation, seems to have appointed himself minister of propaganda within the kingdom of God. With his replacement of circumcision with baptism, the doing away with exclusionary dietary laws, the bestowing of elect status onto Gentiles, and other innovations, he allowed the mustard seeds to plant deep roots. The message of the parable of the mustard seed was strengthened by the parable of leaven, and again he said, "To what shall I compare the kingdom of God? It is like leaven which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour, till it was all leavened," i.e. Matthew chapter 13, verse 33. As Crossan pointed out, leaven, produced from moldy bread, was symbolic of moral corruption in the Bible. To hide leaven in flour until the whole thing had fermented, expanded, and leavened was to actively plant seeds of corruption that would determine the character of the finished product. Women were sometimes associated with the unclean and impure in Judaism, and this analogy is likely traceable to the stigma attached to Jesus himself as unclean and impure because of his half-Roman ancestry. The essential leaven that Jesus introduced was an attack on the morality that preserved the patriarchal family, the morality that relegated Jesus himself to status of an impure woman. Just as Jesus had been excluded from the patriarchal family, Jesus would exclude the rule of the patriarchal family from the true kingdom of God. According to John chapter 15, verse 18, Jesus said, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first." Jesus seemed to believe that the entire world hated him. If Jews hated him for being half Roman, then Romans hated him for being half Jew. Was there no escape from the hate of the world? This was the dark side of being the Son of Man. If his uniquely transcendent spiritual universalism was rooted in being both Jew and Gentile, then his uniquely rootless biological particularism condemned him to be neither Jew nor Gentile, homeless in a tribalistic world. Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Matthew chapter 8, verse 20, alienated from the entire world, he took a spiritual revenge upon the entire world. Jesus understood that the leaven he implanted was subversive to both Jews and Gentiles. A love of others rooted in hatred of the family was an attack on the order of the entire human world. Jesus loved his enemies precisely because he hated his enemies.